My name's Simon Wardley. I work for a company called DXC Technology. What I'm going to talk about is the issue of strategy, which I'm then going to use to talk about maps. Then I'm going to talk about patterns, and then I'm going to talk about methods, and then I'm going to talk about culture, and then on to organization, and then how to fix it all. And we're going to do this all in an hour. It's madness. All right, so I'm going to start off with the whole issue of strategy. For me, this is a long story. So it started in, 2003, 2004. I was working for this company, for Tango, online photo service, about 16 different lines of business, very profitable, revenue growing, but it had a big problem. And that big problem was this person, the CEO. The CEO didn't have a clue what they were doing. They were making it up as they went along. And I know this for a fact because I was the CEO. I was, as far as I could tell, I call myself the fake CEO. I had no idea what we were doing, except for the fact that we were making lots of revenue and we were very profitable. But I used to come up with these wonderful statements. This is us in 2003. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. We were heavy adopters of extreme programming back in 2000. Ken wrote the stuff back in 1999 before the manifesto came out. We're big users of Perl, big supporters of the open source movement. But the reality is I'd taken this statement from another company and literally just changed a few words. And so I was worried that people would eventually rumble, I didn't know what I was doing. So I used to go around recording other executives talking about the issue of strategy. And I used to listen for what I call business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAS for short. And I used to do this every few years. I think this is 2013, roughly. So common BLAS, digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. And then I grabbed a whole bunch of companies' sort of strategy statements and created what I called the BLA template. So our strategy is blah. We will lead a blah effort of the market through our use of blah and blah to build a blah. And then I would randomly insert the blahs and the blah template into the blah template and also generate a bunch of different strategies. Things like this, just total random nonsense. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer-focused competitive advantage and disruptive social media to build a collaborative revolution. So it's almost painful saying it. But I used to send these around, and every time I used to get, the common 3 responses back. Last time, about 400 responses of 3 types. The first was, this is the exact wording from our business plan. The second, I've seen 2 of these used already. And the third, my favorite, was, are you for hire? So a friend of mine put this all online, by the way. If you ever need a strategy, you just type in the URL at the bottom. It'll automatically build you one based upon nothing whatsoever. Our strategy is collaborative. We will lead an open effort of the market through our use of et cetera, et cetera. If you don't like it, it's pretty simple. Just press refresh and it will build you a new one. You can pretend there's AI and blockchain or whatever makes you feel good behind it. It's not. It's just inserted words. Anyway, the point about this story is that back in 2003, 2004, when I started looking into this, I sort of started to realize I wasn't necessarily the only person who was making stuff up. So I think I've read every book I could find on strategy, got nowhere, ended up in a booksellers. She asked me, had I ever read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and I hadn't. So she persuaded me to buy 2 copies, 2 different copies. They're all translations, so they're all different. And I'm very grateful for that, because in the reading of the second version, I came across this particular pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. Number 1, understand your purpose, your moral imperative. 2, understand the landscape that you're actually competing in. 3, understand the climactic patterns. So that's, how the landscape is changing. 4, understand doctrine or principles of organization. 5, you get into gameplay. And then I came across the work of John Boyd, the Mad Major, famous for something called the OODA loop. So you have the game, you observe the environment, that's the first O of OODA, which is all about the landscape and how it's changing. Then you orientate yourself around it, that's what doctrine principles are about. And then you decide where you're going to need to act, and then you act. And at the heart of this are two whys, the why of purpose and the why of movement. So to understand those, think about a game of chess. So the why of purpose might be to win the game, and the why of movement is, do I move this piece over that piece? Do I move here or there? And it's through movement we actually learn how to play the game, assuming we can actually perceive the environment. So that was it. That was my basically strategy cycle. Hang on a second, I've just got something peeping at me over here. So that was my strategy cycle, and it sort of made sense for me. And then I was looking at this, and obviously key to this was understanding the landscape, the environment. And that's how I got into maps. So this is an example of a map. This is the Battle of Thermopylae. Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading. Now, what he decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. And you can look at the map and you see, well, look, we can communicate, we can play different strategies, you know, we can talk about what we want to do with this map. And I thought, well, how was I doing this in business? And I was using something called SWOT diagrams to make decisions. So I thought, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this onto a SWOT diagram. So this is my Themistocles SWOT. Well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses, the e-force might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, because we're actually Athenian, Themistocles. Get rid of the, well, sorry, we're Greek, but get rid of the Spartans as well, because we're Athenian. And the threats the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. And so I was looking at this and going, what would you use to communicate, determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described on a map, or some sort of like magic framework, like a SWOT diagram. And I realized that what I was using was magic frameworks, and what I needed was some sort of map. Now, this particular battle is, you've all heard of it, it's 140,000 Persians, 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans, and this is where we get the story of the 300 from. Okay, so the first thing I did was grab every map I had in my business. And so people brought me business process maps, they brought me mind maps, they brought me systems maps. And then I looked at one of the maps and I thought, right, there's a component there, CRM, customer relationship management. Let's move it on the map. How has that changed? And the answer is, it hasn't. Well, why hasn't it changed? Because if I take a geographic map and I move a piece, like if I move Australia and put it next to the UK, that really has changed that map. But here I can move things around it. It hasn't. And so I started like, let's take that Battle of Thermopylae and let's put it in the same sort of systems diagram format. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, you know, this really isn't a map, is it? And it's not. It's a graph. The problem we have is we keep on using that word map, and I'm afraid it doesn't mean what we think it means. Most things we have in business are not maps. In fact, all of them aren't maps. They're all graphs. So this is a geographic graph. 3 places, Nottingham, London, Dover, connected by 2 roads, M1, M2. This is a map. Can you see the difference? This one's got a compass. To make it a bit more clearer, I just emphasize that in a map, space has meaning. So the 3 graphs at the top are all the same. They're identical. The 3 maps at the bottom are all completely different. And that's the difference between a map and a graph, is that space has meaning. And space has to have meaning because we're trying to explore a landscape. And so that meaning comes from 3 basic characteristics. You have an anchor, such as magnetic north. You have the position of pieces, one relative to another. You have what we call consistency of movement. So you have like magnetic north, this is north, south, east, or west of that, and you have consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. Okay. So then I asked, okay, could we map business? So I started off by mapping one of my favorite things, which was a tea shop. You've got the public and business. Hopefully public wants to drink cups of tea. You've got the business, hopefully wants to sell cups of tea. So I'm going to have anchors here for the public and the business. Now, a cup of tea needs other things. It needs tea, it needs a cup, it needs hot water. Hot water needs cold water, it needs a kettle needs power. So what you've got here is a chain of needs. And the further you go down the chain, the further away or the less visible something becomes. So if I think about a cup of tea, if I'm a consumer of a cup of tea, the power to use the heat the kettle, to make the hot water, to make the cup of tea, I don't care a great deal about that power normally. What I care about is my cup of tea. So I've got anchor and position here. Now I'm missing movement. And it turns out that all of those components were forms of capital, and all of them evolve. And there's a standard pattern by which things evolve. You start off with the genesis of the novel and new, you get custom built examples, then you get products and rental services, and commodity and utility services. So now what I can do is I can take my chain, I take my components, position them where they should be, and this is now a map. I have an anchor, position, and movement. All right, so what? Well, maps are imperfect representations of a space. They're all projections, so they're all imperfect. There's no such thing as a perfect map of France. If it was, it would be one-to-one scale, which means it would be the size of France. It would therefore be France. And as a map, that's pretty useless. So maps are all imperfect representations. But that's good, because it enables other people to challenge and ask things. It invites them to do so. So somebody can look at my map and say, you're missing staff. And somebody else might go, oh, staff, that's robots, that's more commodity. If you say so. Somebody else might question how we're doing things. Why are we custom building kettles? Why aren't we using standard kettles? Somebody might say, oh, it's brand exclusivity. All right, well, at least we can talk about this stuff. It doesn't matter whether you're from development, engineering, whether you're from operations, whether you're from finance, marketing. We can all talk about a landscape using a map. And that's actually really important, because in most organizations generally tend to be led by stories. And the problem is stories are highly political. So we have an entire industry out there persuading people that good leaders are great storytellers, which basically means when you challenge somebody's story, you're actually saying you're not a great leader. So it immediately becomes conflict. And you can get away with this. You can get past this problem with a map. And let me show you how. This was an insurance company. They needed compute. This is their process flow. They needed compute. They ordered servers. Servers went into goods in. So they used to buy lots of compute to put in their data centers. But when they bought the compute, they would modify and mount and rack these servers. And they had a bottleneck in the modification, mount and racking process. So they'd spent 6 months working on a business case for investing in robotics to do this. As many millions of capital expenditure. And they put this whole plan together, return on investment calculation, gone through all the vendors and everything else. And they had their plan for robots. And they asked me to come and have a look. And so they showed me this, and they showed me the plan, and told me how it was going to get rid of this bottleneck and improve their process flow and all the benefits it had. Now, I can't go, why are you using robots? Because I'm now challenging the story that they've created. So I'm just like saying, you're not great leaders, you don't know what you're doing. So you can't do that. So I said, well, can we map it out? And they were like, oh, I don't know about this, blah, sounds complex. It took them 15 minutes. So this is the map that they created. User needs compute, they put compute in product. Order server, they put in commodity. Interesting. Why would you have compute in product and server in commodity? Fine, well, it's okay, it's their assumptions. Goods in. Okay, and they went rack, mount, modify. And I was able to look at that map and say, why have you got racking custom built? And they went, oh, because we have this company that makes our racks for us. Ah. So what are you doing to modifications are you making to servers? Well, they don't fit our racks, so we have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. Ah, and that's why you need robotics, yes. So somebody in the room just went, hang on, why aren't we using standard racks? And this is probably one of the most common problems that I see. Organizations constantly focusing on improving process flow, but the first thing you need to focus on is actually evolutionary flow. So in the case of the insurance company, as soon as they're like, oh, we use standard racks, and we don't have to modify the service. No, we don't. We don't have to spend money on robotics. Now, these people have spent 6 months working on this problem, and they're not daft. They're smart people. Problem is, they were trapped by context, trapped by the stories. So at some point in time, it made sense to use custom-built racks, and that was just like an axiom. It had to be custom-built. But as soon as you map it out, it was just like, that doesn't make sense, does it? No. So that was only a few million. In government, we had particular projects. We saved, 425 million simply by mapping it out, about 1.5 billion in its lifetime. It's not just government, insurance companies. I mean, NASA, the carbon mapper satellite, the project was run between multiple companies using my form of maps in the background for the last 3 years. That's a £100 million project. One of my favorite, though, is this one, HS2 high-speed rail. So high-speed rail, they needed to build, it's a big, heavy engineering project. They needed to build the railway in a virtual world, first of all, because it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we got that wrong, than it is to dig up the English countryside. So back in 2012, they decided to build the whole lot in a virtual world. And James Finley, who was the CIO, drew this systems diagram, systems graph, the components that were needed. And James's problem was this: how do I build this? Which bits do I outsource? Which bits do I build in-house? What do I use off-the-shelf products for? Because those 3 questions applied to that simple systems graph gives you 387 million possible permutations. So which one do I pick? So there was a tendency in government at that time to simply say, let's outsource the whole lot and we'll break it into sensible lots. So we'll group things together because they sound similar. So lot 1 engineering, well, that's that stuff up there. Oh, look, compute data center power, that sounds like infrastructure. We'll have that lot there, lot 4, that'll be a contract. User experience, portal, CRM, that sounds like user experience. We'll stick that in another contract. And these projects generally tended to be complete disasters, as in massive cost overruns, almost never delivered on time. So James is a good friend of mine. I taught him to map many, many years ago. And so he quickly drew a map. This was Sunday afternoon, sent it to me and said, right, how do we actually manage this? For me, this was quite easy because I'd learned this lesson back in 2006. And what I'd learned was that as things evolve, it doesn't matter whether it was compute, penicillin, money, whatever, it would start off on this Genesis side, where it's chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable, changing, different. And the same thing, like compute, you start off with the Z3 1943, you get products like the IBM 650, eventually becomes more of a commodity utility, in which case its characteristics are ordered, known, measured, stable, standard, dull. We know exactly what we want from it. And because of that, we'd learned there was no such thing as one-size-fits-all methods. So lightweight extreme programming was very good on the left-hand side because it was all about reducing the cost of change, and change is normal. The right-hand side, Six Sigma outsourcing to a utility provider was great because it was focused on reducing deviation. I mean, you didn't want change. You wanted no change. You wanted zero change if possible. Now in the middle, lean, so Scrum, MVB, Kanban, all that sort of stuff was good because it helped with learning and reducing waste. So you had 3 different approaches. And so we learned to simply use all 3. So what you do is you the stuff on the left-hand side, build in-house agile techniques, off-the-shelf products in the middle where possible, or use something like lean if you're having to build it yourself. And on the right-hand side, you're outsourcing to utility providers, or if you're building using something like Six Sigma. So we use appropriate methods. And this project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee because it was delivered way ahead of schedule, way under budget. All right. Now, typically, we do the sort of like lot approach. And let me just take that lot 1 engineering, and let's overlay that onto the map. And I can tell you that contract will fail before we've even signed the paperwork. And the reason for this is that in the paperwork, in the contract, you're going to try and define what we're going to have. And some of the bits on the right-hand side can be defined. So they will be efficiently treated and delivered. But the stuff on the left-hand side, you could never know quite what it's going to be. It's going to change. So you're always going to incur excessive change control costs if you try and specify. So the third biggest problem that I usually see, the first one being people optimizing process flow when they shouldn't do. They need to, first of all, concentrate on evolutionary flow, and that's hundreds of millions to billions. The second biggest problem I see is misapplication of methods, and the third one is most contracts that we write fundamentally flawed. Once you map it out and overlay, you can see in the contract that it's going to fail before we've even signed it. Of course, we just end up with a fight with the vendor in these sorts of cases, and the vendor points out to us, it's all our fault because the certain parts are efficiently delivered, and all the bits that weren't delivered well, it's because we kept on changing our mind, and then somebody says we need to specify it better next time. You have no hope at all. So one of the things we also do with maps is what we call pre-mortem challenge, like we map out and challenge the contract and all the rest of it. And then we keep the maps because then we do post-mortem learning. So we go and build something, and then we use the maps to look at what we've built and how it's changed. And from that, we learn patterns. Okay, so there are a lot of different types of patterns in maps. So if I go back to the strategy cycle, we start observing our landscape. The first set of patterns you learn are climatic patterns. These are the rules of the game, basically. So here's a very simple map using these application, best coding practice, runtime operating system, best architectural practice on compute. The first pattern you learn is everything evolves. If there's supply and demand competition, it moves from left to right. Second pattern you learn is you have inertia, normally caused by past success. So we get good at, say, computers are products, say data centers and architectural practices based upon this. We have inertia to change. Inertia to that shift to a utility. The third pattern you learn is that as things evolve, you get co-evolution of practice. So as compute went from product to a utility, its characteristics changed, and this enabled a new set of practice. In this case, the characteristics, what we call MTTR, mean time to recovery, we go from high to low. So computers, a product, take months to get a new machine, computers, a utility, seconds. So we can go from architectural practices, which are all based upon N+1, scale up, all this sort of stuff, i.e. trying to make machines very resilient, because if the machine goes bang, it's months to get a new one. We now distribute systems designed for failure, chaos engines, because basically, it doesn't matter if the machine goes bang, you can have another one in a few seconds. Eventually, those new practices get a name that was called DevOps. But anyway, so compute turns to a utility that enables higher order systems to appear. So the standardization of components and the new practices enable new higher order systems to appear. So we build new services, things like Netflix, and those higher order systems create new sources of value and worth. Those are powerful forces. Now I use these economic patterns, and I've shown you 5, there's about 30 of them, where to invest. So back in 2008, I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical on that whole cloud side. We were up against Microsoft, Red Hat, and others. We used the map, a slightly more complicated version of this, to see where things are changing, where we needed to focus on in terms of building, in terms of cloud, the change of practices, etc., where we need to keep, not focus on best architectural practice for use of computers, product. We need to get out of that space. And so we use the map to target the market. And we were 2 to 3% the operating system market against Red Hat and Microsoft. We ended up being 70% of all cloud. It cost us $500,000 to 18 months. Pretty straightforward. Of course, the emerging practices evolved, eventually got a name DevOps, the runtime evolved, eventually became serverless, that's Lambda, Azure Functions, which of course is creating the same thing, new emerging practice, new needs being created. Point about this is strategy is iterative. Okay, where you would focus today is not where you would focus back in 2008. So if you were trying to play the game today, you wouldn't be like focusing on utility compute, you'd be up at the serverless space. But this strategy is iterative, is a principle that comes out of mapping, and we collect the principles in what we call doctrine. Doctrine just means a collection of principles, and these are universally useful patterns. So climactic patterns are things that rules the game, you can't stop them. Doctrine, you can choose whether to use these principles or not, but they're all universally useful, so I would tend to do them. And the ones that come from mapping, very simple, focus on the user need. It's top of mapping anyway. Understand the details, understand what is being considered, how evolved the components are, challenge assumptions. It's very difficult to do in a story world, very easy to do with maps. Use appropriate methods. Have a bias towards data. That's why we use maps for learning. So we do pre-mortem, challenge on the map, do the stuff, and then we look at what happened and use the map to learn new patterns. Anyway, there's about 40 of those. I'll just put that up there. This stuff is all Creative Commons. You can just help yourself to it. So there's about 40 universally useful principles that we found out of mapping. Obvious things: know your users, focus on user needs, remove bias and duplication, use appropriate methods, know the details, bias towards data. I mentioned some of them, including slightly more advanced ones. But most companies are pretty atrocious at all of these. Then you get into the leadership bit. So there's 30 climactic patterns, 40 odd doctrine. It's about 100 different forms of gameplay, just over 110. They're all context specific. We don't have time to go through that. One model is called the Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize model. AWS published its second ever book, Reaching Cloud Velocity. It's got 17 pages of my mapping in there. You'll see that the Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize model, if you want to read about it, is in there. You can use this to tear up industries. It's really quite simple. Normally at this point, people say to me, oh, this is all complicated. And somebody then comes along and says, oh, yeah, they would make it all easy. You just need the right method. So let's go into that. I said there's no such thing as one size fits all. You need extreme programming, you need lightweight agile on the left-hand side, all the way to Six Sigma on the right. To break this down a little bit more, I'm going to use some social practice theory from Elizabeth Shea. So we've got a map here. It's the map of compute. Compute went to a utility, enabling a new emerging practice. And there's a best architectural practice for compute as a product. Well, the first problem we have is they both, the emerging practice and the best architectural practice, have a common meaning. We call them architectural practices, though ITIL and DevOps are very, very different. They're very different because they're different competencies. And one is the right competence for compute as a product, and one is the right competence for compute as a utility. Now, when we talk about compute going to cloud, it's got a common meaning again, compute, but two different material instances. So one is about compute as a product or servers, and one is compute as a utility, i.e. cloud. Now, if you think about anything, as something appears, money, penicillin, computing, doesn't matter. When it's in that novel stage, extreme programming has evolved as a practice to be very good in that space because it focuses on reducing the cost of change. Now you might say, well, hang on, I'm mixing practices and things here. That's okay. If I look at the axis at the bottom, Genesis custom product commodity, the original piece of work for this basically says there are 4 stages of evolution. Activities, when we talk about physical things, capital, those are just the labels that we use. Practices, we use novel, emerging, good, and best. Data, model, divergent, convergent, model. They all have the same meaning and same characteristics. And really, we should map stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, but that's just not very helpful for others. So I just shortcut and put Genesis custom product commodity, but you can map data, physical activities, knowledge, practices, even ethical values on a map. So Agile has evolved to be good at something novel and new, but that thing will evolve. And as it evolves, its characteristics change, you get different material instances. And what's happened is other methods have evolved to be good at that space. So lean is great for your product space, reducing waste and learning, and Six Sigma is good on the far right hand side. Now, the problem is the thing we give a common meaning to normally. So we call, I don't know, compute in its various forms. We call it compute. And those method competencies we give a common meaning to. We go project methodology. And which always leads people, if they can't map, to asking, well, why can't we have the one-size-fits-all project methodology? And the answer is because the characteristics of the thing has changed. And so you're going to have a single method which somehow can cope with polar opposites. It's got to be able to cope with constant change and reducing change at the same time. It's not going to happen, which is unfortunately why people try this. It doesn't matter whether they do it with Six Sigma and they try to make it deal with the novel and new, or Agile, and they try and make it deal with the more commodity. They always expand by adding bits on to the actual practice. And then what happens is, well, the practice doesn't work, and then people say, well, you just use the wrong bits of it. And the answer is, no, you're trying to make a single method apply across the whole scale. But still, doesn't stop people from trying. And for the last, I suppose, last 14 years, I've gone to conferences and had people tell me Agile works everywhere. I go to another conference and people tell me Six Sigma works everywhere, etc. And I say, well, they all have context. So they all work in their right context, to which, it's normally heretic, burn him, something along those lines. But there we are. One thing you've got to remember with Agile is there's a world of difference between using and being. So if I go back to something like HS2, high-speed rail, using Agile basically means we use extreme programming methods on the left-hand side. Being Agile means we used appropriate methods across the whole lot. Okay, so I could have used Agile, extreme programming, across the entire lot, and it certainly wouldn't have made the group Agile. They wouldn't have hit they would have been over budget. They would have had all sorts of problems. In the same way, they could have used Six Sigma across the whole lot, it would cause the same problems. So there's a world of difference between using and being. Using the method, great. I absolutely love extreme programming. Being requires the use of multiple methods according to the context. At which point somebody normally goes to me and says, oh, you just need the right culture. Okay. If I look at a map, you've got a principle, which is use appropriate methods. You've also got in the map 2 different beliefs. There's a world of difference between principles, ways of operating, and beliefs, things we value. That's very, very different things. So in the map, you've got a belief on one side, which is people over process. And on the other side, you've got a belief, which is process over people. And those can opposite beliefs, but they can happily coexist at the same time because they're true for specific contexts, i.e., people over process matters on the left-hand side, process over people matters on the right-hand side. Sometimes, your beliefs, your polar opposite cannot coexist. Belief in God, not belief in God. I mean, there is a sort of compromise there, but sometimes these beliefs aren't exclusive. So that gets me into the issue of culture. And so when it comes to culture, I'll just mention Krober. 50 years ago, basically said, despite a century of effort to define culture adequately, there is no agreement among anthropologists. And it's no different to today. So the experts on culture for 150 years have not been able to agree what culture is. So I love the fact that people come and say, oh, you just need the right culture, because even anthropologists can't even agree what it is. And there is a reason for this. Margaret Mead, one of my favorite anthropologists, pointed out that language is a discipline of cultural behavior. So language is part of culture, which creates a problem. That problem is known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Basically, a no model can be complete and true within itself. So if language is part of culture, you will never be able to explain culture in language alone. So I asked the question, can we map it? So if I go back to those different axes, I said activities, genesis, custom, product, commodity, practices, novel, emerging, good, and best. I can just pick any label from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. So I decided to map out ethical values. So I chose concept, emerging, convergent, accepted. Started off by mapping out a particular collective and what it valued. Universal basic income, paid holiday, unionization. Unionization more accepted, paid holiday, more convergent, universal basic income, still very much emerging. Of course, all of those are based upon underlying components. Underneath these were components of workers' rights and civil rights, what Martin Luther King described as the twin pillars of democracy. Workers' rights come from the Knights of Labour movement, which is connected to the abolition of slavery, and those connected to reciprocity and fairness. So what you've got is you can start mapping out values, as in beliefs, within a system. And as with all other components on a map, everything evolves. All the same climactic patterns appear. Now, if you take those values and crush it down, this is what we call a pipeline. All we're saying is that single dot of values represents many evolving different components. Well, now we need to expand this out to try and define what culture is. And the best way I found to do that was to get two warring factions, in this case, Brexiteers and Remainers, in the UK in the same building. None of them could talk to each other with stories. So we used the map and that single component, and between the groups, we managed to generate a map of culture. It was fascinating because through the medium of the map, they were actually talking to each other, even though in story form, it was just like almost impossible. The point about this is that within culture, you've got many components: behavior, you've got principles as in doctrine, memory, symbols, rituals, you've got concepts of belonging, safety, agency. There's a huge amount involved. And your problem is we don't belong to a single culture, we belong to many. You could be your company, your family, your church, whatever it happens to be. You just can't copy values from one culture to another. You can't copy the values of Spotify and expect to be Spotify. You can't adopt principles. You need to apply them to the landscape. And of course, there's all sorts of feedback loops, some of them positive and negative. And when I show this to people, people go, oh, this is complicated. Well, culture is. So you can't just go, yeah, we just need the right culture. Just follow these values or whatever it happens to be, because it's an incredibly complicated subject. So then people just tell me what you need is just the right organization. And that's another mess. So if I go back to Fatango, this is how I was organized back in 2002, different silos. Financial, there's me at the top, line of business, project management, IT, ops, customer support, all this sort of stuff. And there were lots of fights going on between the silos. So I decided to introduce in 2003 the idea of product owners. And we would have teams built of many different skill sets in these. I thought this is going to solve my problems. And what happened, we ended up with more fights. And I couldn't quite understand this until I realized that we were sometimes building new things and sometimes doing old things. So what we had were like dev, development of new things, and more sort of core stuff. So I split the company into dev and core. This is bimodal, about 8 years before Gartner started talking about the subject. And it caused absolute warfare, almost killed the company. And I couldn't understand why. Fights were just it was just horrendous. And then by 2005, I had a map. So I started mapping it out. And here's my core group. And here's my dev group building new things. And then what would happen is things would evolve. And then dev would turn up and say, you look after this, and core would go, where's this documentation, and a fight would start. And nothing was evolving. And so actually what was happening was the dev sort of teams were building novel and new things on top. And what we were getting was increasing instability, open warfare, and nothing evolving. And the reason for this is that that sort of middle role of transitioning stuff, I basically undermined it completely by creating two-party structure, by going dev and core. I'd undermine that critical role in the middle. And so if you think about the insurance company, don't focus on process flow, focus on evolutionary flow, how things are evolving. This is exactly what I did with my company. I decided I needed to reorganize, dreadful terms, pioneers, brilliant people who built the novel anew, settlers who could take that stuff and turn it into something useful for others, and town planners who could industrialize the stuff. And so we had to build around the concept of evolutionary flow. And I pitched that idea from a 1993 book, Robert X. Cringely, Accidental Empires. He was talking about different types of companies. I did it as a single company. So this is what we did in 2005. I reorganized the company. I now had chief pioneer, chief settler, chief town planner, not finance or anything along those lines. We had common attitudes. So one's focused on the novel anew, one's focused on industrialization. We ran different aptitudes or skill sets through it. So finance group, engineering group, whatever it happened to be. And then we build cells with common attitudes. And then to make it all actually work, we introduced something known as the system of theft. So the product owners, so what would happen is you'd get some pioneers building something. The settlers would invade still their work, forcing the pioneers to go on and do more pioneering. And the town planners then would invade the settlers and still their work, forcing the settlers to invade more, et cetera, et cetera. We could do it all because we had maps. So using maps, we could quite easily identify common components, break them down into, well, we could identify the components, group them together more sensibly, break them into small teams, apply the right attitude, and manage evolutionary flow that way, which is what we did. Great guns. You can read more about this in GCHQ. It's Intelligence Services have this particular document called Boiling Frogs. It's completely open. Help yourself, completely free, a bit like the work here. It's exactly the same structure. But there was a problem, because lots of people get very excited by the structure. But it's a bit like being on the Titanic. People go, oh, we can move the deck chairs about and everything will be fantastic. You've got to deal with the hole in the side of the boat first. And the hole, it turns out to be doctrine. So when I say, you've got these 40 odd basic principles, if you don't have those in place and you're not good at them, then if you try to implement a structure like Pioneer Settler Town Plan, I can tell you will fail, because everybody who's tried has failed until they've got these principles in place. And these principles are very simple. Understand your users, focus on user needs, understand the supply chain, understand how evolved the components are, so know the details, understand what is being considered, use appropriate methods. If you do all of these all the way up the list, you'll naturally find yourself gravitating into Pioneer Settler Town Planner structure anyway, because you'll break down into smaller teams. But if you attempt to do it and you don't have this in place, every example in there has failed. So this comes back to how to fix things. Well, stop looking for magic methods, cultural hacks, and org structures. That's the first thing I would do. I would start by sorting out your principles. So the title of this was Agile is a Cult and How to Fix Things. I find extreme programming and Scrum fantastic methods. I love the Agile Manifesto, but it needs to be even more. I was talking with Ken about this because it's been taken and more things have been bolted onto it. In fact, it needs to recapture itself. It needs to be as lightweight as possible because it's focused on constant change and reducing the cost of change. And that's what it should focus on. We need other methods and other techniques when we're talking about, development of products. So sure, Lean, Scrum, MVP, all that sort of stuff, great. And when we're talking about, industrialized components, sure, outsource, Six Sigma, great. If we want to be, it's not just about using Agile. Being Agile is about using all of those methods at the same time. But in order to do this, we need to understand our landscape, which means we need to focus on the user needs. We need to understand the components involved, and most importantly, we need to understand how evolved those components are. And if we don't have that, if all we have are stories, then all we're going to get into is one size fits all. We're going to attempt to apply Agile everywhere or Six Sigma everywhere. And then we'll start blaming people for using the wrong bits of the process, when in fact it's supposed to be a method which was people over process. So polar opposite. So stop looking for magic methods, cultural hacks, or structures. Start sorting out your principles. And just go back, there are a simple list of 40 odd principles. Start at the bottom, know your users, focus on user needs, just move your way up through the top. And that's it. It's all Creative Commons share alike. You'll find there's an entire book I wrote on this, medium.com, Wardley Maps, help yourself. There's an entire community of people out there mapping for everywhere from the UN to the NHS to heavy engineering to software companies to security companies, all in sorts of different areas. We have a map camp once a year where people from all over the world turn up. There's tools being built. It's an entire community. And I started off with the issue of strategy. I hadn't got a clue what I was doing. I was running a company, being successful, but that's more blind luck. I got into maps because I realized that was a problem that I had. From those maps, I learned various patterns. There's a lot to learn. There's climatic patterns, so these are the rules of the game. There's doctrine, principles, universally useful patterns, and then there's context-specific patterns, which we call gameplay. One of the patterns that you'll get is use appropriate methods. Can never be a one-size-fits-all, purely because things evolve, and as they evolve, their characteristics change. And so at the end, they are polar opposite, but they're also different in the middle. And so you can't have the magic method which applies to all three of them. Well, I suppose you could bundle it all into one method and give people a way of using the appropriate bit of the method. You may as well split methods into three. Culture, its attitude and behavior is important, but these are really, really complex topics which we can barely define. So just reaching for that handle, lots of people do say, oh, you've just got to have the right culture. It's a field which we poorly understand. And then people often reach for the organizational lever, particularly executives, because that's an easy one to reach for. Consultants will come in and say, oh, if you use this organization, okay, you can do stuff in that space. Most effective I've known has been the pioneer, set a town planner structure. But the problem is you can't go anywhere near it unless you've got your doctrine, your principles in place, and you can't do that until you start mapping the space. So I would tend to avoid culture, organization, single magic methods. Start with those principles to begin with, and that's how I fix it.